Reactive Training Systems.
I relate to what you're saying in a lot of ways, because I feel like, not that I'm, on the level of a physicist or something like that, but it's the idea of like grinding through stuff to try to come up with something useful on the other end. I've, John probably remembers, like around 2018, I was talking about um, kind of questions around fatigue and it driving me crazy a little bit. And I would like write these long, these long, just thinking out loud posts and post them in our Slack channel. And I'm not sure if they made any sense to anyone else at all, but it was kind of a working through process of trying to wrap my head around. Like there was something that didn't quite add up that I was seeing in how we and others in the field were talking about this, and just trying to make sense of it.
And is this related to how you eventually came up with, say, your stress index dashboard, or are these different things?
This was a different thing. This came after the stress index a little bit. This is kind of a precursor to what ended up being, it's Track R right now, but it's um, I'm still kind of running it as an experimental program, but it's dynamic load management, so that we're taking into account fatigue and recovery rates, and stress index is part of it. But then we're also breaking down the stress on like which tissues are certain movements hitting and how are those tissues recovering, what can take more training load and how are we assessing the training load. Like all these decisions are being made, but it's trying to assess it all dynamically. So if you overshoot today, you know, should that affect your programming tomorrow? I mean, by default, we kind of say, um, we kind of, lots of coaches say, no, it shouldn't, but is that the right answer? Or is that a shortcut, And it's like trying to take that, like kind of the idea is like, what would you do if you only had one client and you were just going to do as well for that one client as possible? Would you just say, forget it, you get it next time, or would you make some small adjustments?
Yeah, I think like context matters, and it goes back to this discussion around nuance. Like if, you just use the term overshoot, that can mean so many things, and the results of that, depending on what's going on in life. Like if right now my life is a little more stable than it has, no, that's not true. My recovery has been better than it has been in the past. But let's say you programmed an RP7 single and I just brain farted. I threw on an extra 15 kilos on accident. And now I'm doing an RP10 grinder. And let's say I'm doing a lot of travel, so the system's not resilient. And then you'd ask, like, should you change the programming tomorrow? I'd say, like, given that context, like, yeah, maybe you should.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to, like, I think this might act as a good case study for, as I was thinking through what we might talk about today, I just started with this question of like, what is RTS? And it could be many, many things. It's like methodology, it's company, it's the team, it's this whole product portfolio. And so if I go back to like this example of Track R, at some point you started with, it's just Mike has this bug in his ear around fatigue and wants to write something. And so you're dumping things into the Slack channel. And eventually it starts to congeal into like a more singular idea or set of ideas. And then I think the flip where this turns into a business is you say, and I want to turn this into a formula or methodology, which I'll turn into a feature on a software tool that gets sold to the public. And I actually have no idea like how that flow works in the life of the RTS organization or of Mike Tuchscherer. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that might be a decent example, so like where it's at, you're right. It started as kind of some ideas we would write and talk about, and then it turned into what's been like a long series of spreadsheets, and my total abuse of Google Sheets, turning it and trying to make Google Sheets be an app, even though it ought to be an app at this point, but I'm just forcing it into Google Sheets still. So at some point, from there, I think the next answer is when it's stable enough into a system that I'm not making changes to it, like fundamental changes to it on a frequent basis, then we can put the effort into developing it into a more stable software, and then it would be available for athletes to use, or possibly we'd make it available for other coaches or other athletes or something like that.
And then I don't actually know who does the software development for RTS.
So we have a full-time software developer these days, Casey, who he comes from his prior job was in developing software for a medical technology company. But I somehow talked him into taking this job, and he's been doing this for quite a while. I want to say like 2016 or so, somewhere around that time frame. And like prior to that, I've worked with a good handful of different developers over the years. We probably started with custom development, and shortly after the company started in 2008.
Okay. So and so let's pick into this. So I'm trying to think about, like, so in your audience, I know there's lots of powerlifters, there's lots of powerlifting coaches. I see this proliferation of online coaching businesses. And I think about where I see a lot of them start. It's just, I have an Instagram, I put out and say, hey, I'm taking on clients. I might have a degree, I have some experience. Come train with me. And that was you a long time ago. And then at
DM me
some
for
point,
coaching.
it proliferated into like, okay, I have an approach. I have the Reactive Training Systems approach, and I write a manual. And then you have more clients. And then at some point, like, online courses appear, and then tools start to appear, and then you got to build a team. And so I'm trying to think about, like, how do you get from where the next generation of online coaches is to where you are today, where if you look at in the powerlifting world, the suite of things that RTS is, between methodology, company, and this product portfolio, along with software tools, which really no one has, that's pretty breathtaking.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a long time. I don't know that I would advise everybody to take the same path. I know that I wouldn't. Um, we've put tons and tons of resources into, say, developing our website, and I just don't think that that's a good use of resources for most people. I think it makes sense for us, but like you said, it's because of the other components that kind of go along with the brand of the methodology, and it being different from what I would say is like typical of powerlifting coaching. So it makes it, like, stress index comes to mind, and the way that we use RPE, or the way that we think about exercise selection, things like that, means that lots of the more traditional software tools maybe don't fit the need for us quite as well as we would want. So that's where we kind of get into some of the more custom development and stuff. But kind of back in the beginning, I've talked before about how I got my start in coaching with the Air Force Academy powerlifting team. And that's where a lot of the core ideas around auto-regulation and RPE and stuff like that started. And from there, I would say the methodology came first for me, because there was the method at that point. And after I graduated, before, like, there was about a year before there was a company, and during that time, I had my own forum um, where I was keeping a training log, and other people could keep training logs, and we would talk about training and whatnot. So like there was a community, there was a methodology. We would talk about training, and then eventually it became a book, which is kind of the methodology described, right? Like this is kind of a externalization of this methodology, and it was then that somebody contacted me and said, "Hey, will you coach me online?" And I didn't know that you could do that.
Oh,
And so then we
interesting.
started coaching. Yeah.
I had assumed
Yeah.
it was the reverse. Like you were already coaching a bunch of people and getting to test a lot of your ideas in practice. And maybe you were doing that with the Air Force
Yeah.
powerlifting team.
Yeah. Yeah. It had been developed like in person, but I hadn't coached anybody online at that point.
Can you talk a little bit about so you've been coaching the team and the methodology is coming together. Where were you like, hey, I'm onto something? And, my mad scientist thoughts, I feel like they're starting to come together into a system. And so that's one thing. And then the second thing is like you putting these things down on paper and then writing a book is not an easy process. But something sparked in
No.
you said, I'm going to invest in this. Like, what happened there?
I was starting to piece this stuff together just in an effort to coach the guys on my team. And you would notice things, I would notice things, and incorporate that into the system. A big inspiration in those early days was West Side, because they were really the only ones who were writing about training in a thoughtful kind of way. And I know that the mood in powerlifting has shifted over the years, and that's fine. That's how things go. But then in the early 2000s, there wasn't a lot available. There was like linear periodization stuff, but there wasn't much thought behind it. It was just like, this is what it is, just do it. And I wanted to know why. Whereas Louis and all of his writings, the stuff in Powerlifting USA and whatnot, was a lot more explanatory. It at least attempted to give a rationale for a lot of the stuff. So that was a big influence in the early days there. And so I was implementing that, and then noticing things that either weren't working or things that I felt like I learned and was trying to pass on to my teammates and so on. And it was around the time that I was uh, graduating from the Air Force Academy, so I'm not coaching that team anymore. And I'm thinking, I want to write down the stuff that I learned, and maybe I'll get it published as an article series. I'll try to publish it in Powerlifting USA. And it kind of grew and grew and grew. And before long, I said, I wonder if I could kind of package this together and self-publish it as a book. I had no infrastructure at that point. So my initial investment into RTS was $300 to hire an editor for the book. And that was it. The whole company has been bootstrapped off of that $300 initial investment. And from that, you know, I bought however many initial copies of the manual, and I contacted people who were selling powerlifting stuff at the time. So Lifting Large was one of them. There were a few. I don't even know if these companies are still around, or if they are, I'm sure they're a lot different than they were then. But people who had websites and e-commerce stuff, and so I would sell the book to them, and they would distribute it through their site. And somebody got me in touch with Dave Tate at Elite after a year or so. And so eventually they started carrying it as well. And then when I started the online coaching piece of it, that's when things really started to grow. And there was enough at that point that I thought, I can begin investing in my own e-commerce platform and things like that.
And at this point, just for more context, so at this point, were you didn't have kids yet?
Right.
Were you married?
Yeah. Yeah. So this would have been 2007 to 2008. So I
Okay.
was married, but no kids. I was a Air Force officer stationed in North Dakota. My wife was also an Air Force officer. So that's kind of the life circumstances around that time.
Okay, so there's now like another interesting transition of like I'm an Air Force officer. I have this
Yeah.
emerging career, so you made some decision of, okay, I'm no longer an Air Force officer. I'm going to become an entrepreneur and build this thing. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit? Like what was your what were you thinking? I don't mean that like a
Sure.
what the hell were you thinking, but
No,
what
this
were
is
you
kind of that
thinking?
too.
Yeah. And what actually what did your wife think?
So she's been super cool this whole time, by the way. Our well, hold on, let me tell the story first. So uh, that transition came around 2012. So my commitment to the Air Force was 5 years. So I was doing all the coaching and everything on the side during that time. So just during free time and whatever else. Um, so it was growing. I was coaching more people. I was doing very well competitively as well during that time, which helped a lot. And then, around 2012, my commitment had kind of come up. My wife had orders to Aviano Air Force Base in Italy. They did not have my job at Aviano in Italy. Um, Not that it would have mattered. I was already kind of thinking, hey, I'm spending all my free time running RTS. You know, I think I can make it work. And I'm like looking at the numbers. Oh, I've got to coach this many people. I forget what the number was, like 40 or 50 people. Can I scale up to that? You know, I didn't have anybody else working for me at the time. Well, we had a web developer, but even that was like on a contract basis, so no other like full time employees or anything. So I'm thinking like, oh, could I, out of you know 7-8 billion people in the world, can I find 50 of them who are willing to hire me for powerlifting coaching? I think like, and I would go over the math and over it and over it and over it and over it, and thinking like, yeah, this should work. It should work, but it was just scary, you know. And but eventually pulled the trigger on it and got out, and went great.
Yeah, so
Um,
you had like a nice natural transition point where your term with the Air Force was going to end, and so you were like, I am
mhm.
forced to make a decision right now.
Yeah, yeah. I could have committed to another. It would have been a 2-year hitch, so not super long term or anything, but um, it, it does come with like break points. So that was a natural break point, and if I had stayed in, uh, I wouldn't have gone to live with my wife, which was definitely a consideration. But I was saying too, like she's been super supportive of all of this the whole time. Like our kind of family strategy here is that she views herself as kind of the stability in terms of being like a more stable, predictable income for the family. And then my role has been, something that has more volatility, but hopefully potential for a greater upside. Like you're not going to really hit a financial windfall in the military. Like it's a good job.
Yeah.
But you know what you're going to get, and you're going to get that thing, and that's what it is. So potential for things less expected, that's going to come to me.
Okay, so it sounds like there's actually a few things like the universe nudging you to start RTS, where you had the end of your Air Force career, you had some signals from, say, the powerlifting community, like, hey, I think there's a thing I can build here. And then actually by doing this online business, you were able to now live with your wife in Italy, which is a
Yeah.
pretty big motivator.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, you know a lot of it's, you grow to the constraints that you're dealt with, that you're dealt. just that you're dealt, I guess. One of them being, since we move frequently, I've kind of developed it to be all online. There's never been much temptation to have like an RTS center anywhere or anything like that, because we're going to move in a few years anyway.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of cleaning and maintenance and leases. And
it's like the least favorite job of any gym owner, I think.
yeah. So let's think about, say, the next phase. So at some point you're a solopreneur, and then you have to at some point think about like, okay, I can't scale this thing further. I need to consider bringing on some team members beyond, like the contractor who works on the website. Can you talk about that transition? Like what broke you to say, I got to do something different here?
Yeah, I was coaching far too many people, honestly. I think at my peak, probably would have been 2012, 2013, somewhere in there. I got up to around 80 or so,
Ooh.
which was crushing. It was just coaching all the time, and there were more people who were ready to sign up, so they were being waitlisted. And I'm looking at it going like, this doesn't make sense. This is a bad idea. It would make more sense to try to scale a different way. Obviously, hire on assistant coaches and things like that. Which, bear in mind, like, this was, again, 2012, 2013 timeframe, somewhere in there. At least to my knowledge, this had not been done a whole lot at that time. So in 2008, when I started, like, I didn't even know that you could coach people online. It never occurred to me, and then just started doing it. So by then, by 2012, 2013, I'm thinking, I'm getting crushed here. We need to do something different. Like, now hiring an assistant coach seems like an obvious move, but it didn't seem that way then, and but that is what we ended up doing. One of them was Mark Robb, who's still he's your coach.
Yep.
So,
Yeah. I just emailed him today.
yeah. So I mean, it was cool. He was I think the first one. It was either the first or the second one. I think he was the first assistant coach that we picked up. Mark has been, and before that, he was a client. He's been in the RTS ecosystem since 2009, like right after it started. So he's as OG as it gets. But yeah, so then we, had more commitments to a web developer at that point. It was a little bit more than, just, hey, when we need stuff, we, contract on it per project. It is still contract based, but a little bit more formal. And then we started bringing on assistant coaches. But in that initial stage, like, I couldn't even do that. Like, I just had to let my roster shrink first, because I didn't have time to train anybody. I didn't have time to do anything, coaching that many people. And I didn't feel good about saying to people, you got to go, So I said, well, I want to let things run their course naturally. So I just continued waitlisting people, but just didn't bring anybody else on until the roster went down, and I could train some people up to be assistant coaches.
Okay, so you basically, now you have the indefinite wait list. You're trying to bring on more supply to meet the demand.
Yeah.
And around this phase, so like the next place I want to kind of pick your brain is that at some point you've hired a bunch of coaches, but I'm looking at this call, you have your director of operations, John, here. He went from a stable of coaches to, okay, we kind of need some roles and responsibilities here because this is turning into a real organization.
Right.
How far did you get on the phase of like just bringing on coaches and you're running the business?
That went until 2015, 2016. I think, somewhere in that range. And what happened, we probably needed it before then, almost certainly needed it before then. And I think we probably had people who were picking up slack here and there. And I just didn't have the tools available, which is interesting. So like my degree is in management. This should be right up my alley, but you don't learn a lot of at least I didn't learn a lot of the practical stuff, which is what I was hoping to learn in my degree, but it didn't.
It's kind of like getting a degree in lifting and then finding out like, oh, and you got to spend all that time under the bar to actually get strong.
Yeah. What turned the corner for me was I read a book called Traction, and it was about running small businesses, and it's extremely pragmatic. It's written. Maybe tooting my own horn too much here, but I think of it as like if you took the RTS manual and translated it into being about business, is something like that. It's like first do this, then do this, then do that. It was very procedural, process oriented, and I read that and implemented tons of the ideas from that book. And that's when we started having someone in charge of operations, having someone in charge of marketing, having someone in charge, more defined roles and responsibilities, and trying to put the right people in the right seats, and having business processes to go along with training processes.
Okay, so that's now like that's another interesting transition that I don't want to gloss over, because I've had to do that, say, in different workplaces where you have, let's say you have a team of coaches, and at some point you say, I need someone overseeing operations, marketing, software development. And you look across your current team and you might have some of that, but you have what you have, but you got to transition to the new structure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about that process?
And I've been very lucky to have good people to put in the seats that we have available. I haven't always made the right decisions around that, but like looking back on it, the right people were there. I could have just like for example, currently we have Ross, who's in charge of marketing. Ross has been with the organization since I think 2015, 2016, somewhere in there. So he's been here, but only recently has he filled the marketing director role. And he didn't immediately come to mind for me because he wasn't so much like, I was thinking at the time like we needed somebody who was more on the creative side, but that's not really what that role required. It needs somebody who's got strong organizational skills, who can make plans and carry them out. And Ross is really great at that stuff. And so he's been doing great in this position, even though he's not like a film editor kind of. He's not coming to work with a beret and stuff, but like, I mean, that's just another thing I had to learn, and kind of learn the hard way. It's like so many of these lessons are obvious once you learn them, but before you learn them, they're not so obvious. That's why you got to learn it, I guess.
Well, it's interesting. Now, if I think about it a different way and you say, okay, I need to, in some point I'm going to build an organization with like specific functions, but right now I just need to hire general talent. And so, but you now have had to hire coaches that are a culture fit for Reactive Training Systems. And if I think about what that might be, that is someone who believes in, they need a growth mindset. They need to be somewhat exploratory. They're comfortable in the nuance. They understand how to coach and be coached. That's a pretty good starting point for someone. So even if they don't have the core skills, to say, I need a marketing director, and then look across and say, who can grow into that? that's a pretty good starting point from like a both attitude and aptitude standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, John has been instrumental in helping us find people like that as well. Because I mean, I think I would be comfortable saying like I came into this with coaching knowledge and have continued to develop a lot of coaching and in particular programming knowledge. I've been a comparative lightweight on the business knowledge, and I've learned a lot along the way, but it's been a lot of lessons like what I'm describing now, like, oh, made that mistake again. Maybe I should build a process around this, right? But John came in with knowledge, experience around hiring, and I'm telling you, just for me to sit and take a back seat and let John do his thing has been awesome. It's been great. So
let's can we bring John into the story, because I think this is another interesting transition where, you know, you've grown RTS as your baby, and for a lot of the next generation of powerlifting coaches who are growing their approaches, they're going to have to go through this transition of like, this is my baby, I have a John here, and I know what John does, and he's very good at it, but now I have to also think about, there's certain things I got to let go of right now and empower John. And depending on the person and their experience, they may struggle more or less with that. Like, what's that process been like for you guys? And has there been, you know, what are the ups and downs that you're willing to share?
I think if I can speak for John, John hasn't even got a chance to talk, and I'm speaking for him. One of the things that has happened, I end up being a bottleneck for lots of things. A lot of the reason why things are slow to develop or anything like that would be because I tend to be a bottleneck. I'm time constrained in a lot of ways. And I try to get out of the way and let, you know, guys like John just do the work, because they're more than capable of doing it. And it's not, I don't have any concerns about ability to do it. Like, they've proven that out for a long time. It's more like, I just want to be involved. Like, this is cool to me, and I want to do the stuff that I can do, you know, but then lots of it you just never get around to. So I've noticed what John and Ross have started to do is they just do it anyway. You know, they're capable of doing it. So if they can, they just take care of it, you know, and I'm usually like, oh yeah, thanks. You know, that was way faster than I would have been able to do. So, thinking about specific examples of like, it might be, you know, fixing some payment tracking spreadsheet or something like that, where, you know, maybe I built the thing years ago, so I know where, like, how it's supposed to work. Hey, Mike, this thing stopped working. Can you fix it? Yeah, I'll fix it. And then, you know, weeks go by. Maybe John just gets in there and fixes it, you know, and it might take him longer than it would have taken me because since I built it, I understand it, but I'm not going to get to it for another couple of weeks. So he can just take care of it himself. So I don't know. John probably has better examples than that.
That's probably the most recent one. And I think part of the hardest thing, I think, for Mike and really any CEO and any person who's in charge of a small organization that's growing is just time, you know, because Mike needs to be the visionary of the company. He needs to be the one doing podcasts with multiple different, you know, organizations in time and research and development. Like, that's where his time, really the biggest amount of his time, needs to go. And he needs to be involved in marketing. And I think the biggest thing for Ross and I is to try to find ways to give him that time, you know, because he's time constrained. And if we can find ways to do that and sort of take care of things for him, or just kind of check in, or just ask for permission sometimes forgiveness, you know, if you make a decision. But I mean, hey, that's part of growth, right? Like, you make a decision, it's not the one that maybe Mike would have made, or in hindsight we would have made. It's a learning opportunity. And so I think that's the biggest thing for me. My perspective is, how can I take things off of Mike's plate so that they can be done in a way with a person who has a little bit more time to do it, or who is interested in developing the skill. Because that's the other thing is, like you went back to the conversation with Ross moving from operations into marketing. And he was originally in operations, but Mike brought him in for operations. And then when I was hired, I stepped into the operations role. And then Ross went into the special projects role, where he was able to work on a lot of things, kind of all over the place. Basically anything that needed the connecting of dots, that was Ross, right? And then there was some turnover in the marketing role, and Ross was able to step into that. And the cool thing about Ross is he has this continuing desire to learn and educate himself with bringing all of those skills that Mike had mentioned before. And what was cool about that for Mike was just sort of kind of empowering Ross to make those decisions and to learn. And one of the things I always say in an organization is, you have skill, will, and capacity. And that's what you're always constantly trying to manage. There's, what does the current knowledge of the employee or the person in the role have right now? Skill. There's the will. How much desire do they have to learn or to enhance their role? And then there's capacity, just sheer, hey, if you're coaching 80 athletes, you don't have much capacity to do anything else. So there's this constant managing of those things. And so what I look at in my role is, how can I improve Mike's capacity while also looking at myself and developing my skill set? And sometimes that's, hey, I'm going to go in and figure this thing out that Mike wrote in the spreadsheet that I have no idea about, and you learn it. Or Ross, for example, was not a marketing director before. You figure it out, you learn, you get thrown to the wolves and you kind of figure it out. And then there's, just sheer managing of capacity and knowing when to raise your hand. When you're talking before, Newton, about sort of the dynamic between Mike and I and the things that we've had to learn, I think Mike mentioned before about him sort of being a bottleneck, which I think is the truth for any person in charge of any small organization, or any organization for that matter. I think one of the biggest challenges is, when you have people that are this committed, like Ross and I and other people in the organization, it's very easy to say yes all the time because you're bought in, right? So you've got skill, will, capacity. And if you look at like the will, I mean, we're through the roof. We just want to keep learning. We want to keep growing. We want the organization to grow. And one of the things that we have to learn is to our own capacity. And sometimes, so this is where I see the organization now, is having like a true sort of hierarchy and people in different roles within the organization. You have areas of responsibility developing that are not just one individual, right? So you don't just have marketing director, you have people within marketing, or you have more than just one operations person, you have people doing specific roles. And that's where I see the organization growing to next. Because we also have to do the same thing. We have to raise our hand and say, because on the other end of it, if you run out of capacity and you start going into discretionary time for people and things of that nature, you can actually impact will and thereby impact the person's ability to want to learn more skill. So that is a very important thing to manage. And that's, so like my background is on some of that, is being able to manage teams and to manage people and to recognize those things. And that's one of the things that we constantly pay attention to. Every week we're looking at our demand and capacity to make sure that we're not overloading our coaches. They have to be able to coach with the highest quality, and we need to make sure that they do that. One of the things that I've heard in the past is when you have someone come on for consumption of any type of product or even a service, there's the donut analogy. If you go to Dunkin' Donuts, you should just be able to go bite into the donut and know the quality, right? Like at any different location. And it should roughly feel the same. There's going to be nuances, in how they greet you and what happens. But the ultimate test of the product is biting the donut. And that's what we want for our clients, right? Like if you work with me or you work with Ross or you work with Adam or Peter or Gabby, Kenny, it doesn't matter. You should still get a good quality bite of that donut. You should still get the RTS experience of what it's like to be an all access coaching client. If we overload our coaches, then they can't produce that same level of quality. So we need to pay attention to that. And that's a super important thing for our organization.
So that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like as you're scaling, you are that, what's that bite of the donut is it's one of the things that you keep in mind to make sure you're scaling really thoughtfully. Like if you don't scale fast enough, then the bite of the donut, like people are underserved. If you don't scale faster, then people can't even try a bite of the donut. At some point, you also have to bring in like the economics of it. So I'm a little recency bias. I've been reading this book by Donald Miller, How to Build a Small Business, where he talks about, with your vision and mission, you need to define like the 3 economic principles for your organization. And then every role you add has to tie to one of those economic principles. And so maybe if I generalize a little more, like, how do you guys talk about money in all of this? Because I think most of us, I hope no one gets into powerlifting for money, because that's just a bad idea. But
There's easier ways to go about it.
Yes. But at some point, you're building a successful business. And you're like, okay, we got to talk about money. Can you talk a little bit about like how does that come up in RTS conversations? And like what do you feel like works well, and where does it get weird?
I wonder if it's not like selling a little bit, that it's weird at first, but then the more you do it, you kind of develop a comfort with it. I mean, I'll say that I'm pretty open about our company finances within the organization. Very open about it with John and Ross. So like we have a weekly staff meeting, and pretty much every week, I'm talking about this is where our net income's at. This is where our cash flows are, how cash flow is looking right now. Because I want them to be very aware of like what the big picture is, and be able to tie their own impact into that. So we did recently a promotion of some of our emerging strategies courses. So I wanted, it's not even like a special effort. It's just part of our normal process to talk about our cash flows and stuff like that. But it's very easy then to see, hey, we did this promotion, and this was not only did we get this many sales, but this was the downstream impact on, how much do we have just overall, like what is our total cash assets, so I'm really open about all that stuff. I keep a scorecard, which is one of the things I learned from that book Traction. I've built it out a lot because, of course, if you give me a spreadsheet, I'm going to make it a monstrosity. So we use kind of a scorecard method, but I brief the team on kind of scorecard updates every week. John does something very similar on the operations side with all the coaches in general. Like this is our current status of coaching. How many people are we coaching? What's our retention rate like? This is what our demand capacity is like, and so on and so on. That way everybody is super aware of like where's the team at, overall health of the organization. How do my decisions impact the more strategic picture, I guess.
Wait, something you kind of glossed over there, and I might propose like a new career path for you. So you talked about the current suite of RTS tools that you've turned into a software package. It all started as complex spreadsheets. So right now you have one of those complex spreadsheets that's basically a dashboard for how do I run my online coaching business?
Yeah.
I think you should productize that and sell that, because that tool, while the RTS dashboards help you get stronger, that tool helps businesses make money. And I think that's usually where more money is.
So we're going to clip that clip, Newton, and we're going to send it to Ross for marketing.
If you need someone to come in and help run that, let me know, because that sounds pretty fun and I think potentially lucrative.
Man, I mean, you're probably onto something. It's stuff like this. I've talked to people over the years who have encouraged me to speak more on like the business side of things, which I find really interesting. But I think I'm still at the stage where, I don't know, it's not quite imposter syndrome. Like, I don't feel like I'm an imposter necessarily, but like, I don't feel as much authority on a lot of the business topics as I do on, say, coaching topics. I feel like a lot of this stuff is like, well, yeah, I mean, that's the way I did it. I'm not totally sure that that's the best way, or it's just the way, and it kind of works. Like when it comes to retention metrics, like we knew that we wanted to figure out like what our client retention was like, and okay, well, how do people do retention? Like, how do people measure retention? And the ways that that I found that people were doing it didn't make sense to me. It would be if you had a good month of, they would do something like, what's the average, like the average client tenure? Like, well, my average client's been with me for a year, or whatever. And I said, well, that doesn't make sense, because what if you start onboarding more people? Then that affects your metrics in a negative way. And, so things like that. So we developed our own metric for it. And when I describe it to people, it takes them a second to wrap their head around it. So it's not super intuitive, but it's a way that I think makes sense. I think metrics matter from a coaching standpoint. So why wouldn't they matter from a business standpoint too? Things like that. So there's been a lot of that sort of thing, but I don't know. Maybe there's already ways to do this stuff and I'm just not aware of it,
Well, can I just to push on your imposter syndrome, and I've never successfully cured anyone, including myself, of imposter syndrome, so that's not my goal here. But if I framed what you've built in a different way, and I say you now, and the royal you and your team and what you're capable of. So just for some context, on the side of my day job, I've been doing a lot of public speaking on mental health. And then people ask me, like, can you turn that into a workshop? And I started turning those into workshops, and I got a day job. So I don't understand the conflicts of interest. So I'm not charging for them, but I'm just asking for donations to one of my favorite charities. And the amount people are willing to donate just is slowly climbing. I'm like, okay, there's an opportunity here. So I've been researching, like, well, what would it take to build a business out of this that might have some sort of online and in-person presence, kind of like an RTS does, depending on, how and where you guys show up. And so you talk about, like, okay, I need to first drive awareness. And so you build a bunch of free content and get your content marketing machine going. RTS is doing pretty darn good in terms of that, if I compare to relative to what I see in the powerlifting world. From there, now you're driving people to your other properties, like your site where you sell services. And from there, you want to construct a value ladder. It's like, here's my lower price offers. And then as you get further in, like, I have higher price, higher touch offers. And then, probably somewhere at the top of the scale, I have something like all access coaching. And underneath that, I think the other step that you've taken that I don't see a lot of online businesses doing, because it would take a mad scientist who's strangely motivated to want to do this, is the suite of software tools. Or like, you look at that and you're like, who the hell does this? But it's there and it's robust. It's super useful. And so putting your imposter syndrome aside, like, this is, I know you didn't go into this trying to build like the prototypical online services business, but this is now, you run a prime example of that, especially in the powerlifting space, where I don't think there's many of those. So just challenging your imposter syndrome.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, it's interesting how things evolve. It's like convergent evolution in a way. Like, things evolve along certain lines, and you find solutions that work, and they just kind of tend to work. And special cases aren't that special sometimes. There's always nuance to it, but like you described a business machine that starts with your marketing funnel and goes into like a business, value creation machine, something like that. That analogy is that applies to all businesses in a lot of ways. It applies to this one too. It just is populated with powerlifting parts instead of, whatever mental health consideration parts.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about those parts. Because if I had to frame you in a certain way now in this company, John is trying to free you up to do what you do, which is a lot of the visionary work. And you're a particular type of visionary where you're willing to look across fields and take things from people like Anatoly Bondarchuk and now apply it in the world of powerlifting, and then think really hard about it and think about how might this apply in my world, and then go back into the lab and actually test it on yourself and some lifters. Like a prime example, if people haven't been following Mike's journey, is at some point you built 3D front squat handles or 3D printed front squat handles. And to me, it brings up the question, like, who does that? So you're a very particular type of visionary where you are to me, you like to chew on the big concepts. You're also somewhat of an engineer and a tinkerer. And so that takes like the big concepts and you're like, well, I want to apply this and make it practical. And so at some point you kept doing that. And now you've ended up with, I think, say the RTS dashboard captures a lot of your thinking and features. But then if I think about product portfolio, you have workshops, online courses, you have content marketing, various tiers of coaching. Can you talk about how you've thought about that? Like, I have these big ideas, I need to turn them into practical features, and now we got to expand this into like multi-price point product portfolio, which, if I'm a new coach, I'm probably selling my time for money, which is where you started. But someday in the future, like I look at what the Powerlifting Now guys are doing, like, okay, interesting, subscription business model. And, they're probably thinking about where do they want to go in the future? Like, how did you think through that process over the years?
Kind of a, step at a time, and it starts with, one thing, which in my case was a book, but for a lot of people, it starts with coaching, one-on-one coaching, and you're solving problems at that point. And it's just solving problems in a different way. Lots of people go into businesses with like the underlying assumption that they're looking for growth. And you are probably in the beginning, but there does come a point where you've got to decide if you want more growth or not, because the growth of a business comes along with change, and it should not be taken for granted that every business grow as big as it possibly can. That's not what some people want, and I don't know how big I want RTS to grow, but I know that I want it to grow bigger than it is currently. So, all right, if that's what you want, then how do you do that? How do you solve more problems, create more value for people? How do you help people who maybe are just on the margins of people who you're currently helping? So for me, it started with a book, but powerlifting was kind of at a different stage of its existence back then. So if we think about it from a coaching standpoint, that very quickly became the main revenue generator for the company. And you want it to grow, but you're constrained in certain ways, time being a big one. So how do you solve that? Well, we talked about adding in assistant coaches, but one of those kind of lifestyle considerations, I knew I didn't want to manage a team of like 50 coaches, so we just can't scale coaching forever and have it be the thing that I wanted it to be. I wouldn't love it the same way that I love what I'm doing now, so, and these things have a way of changing too. So I don't know if that changes over the next 10 years or not, but that's where we sit right now. So you think of other ways to solve the problem. Like, can you do group coaching? What might that look like? What problems do you encounter and solve those? Okay, well, if you can't coach everybody, but you do notice that there's lots of other coaches who are interested in what you're doing, can you help them? Well, maybe we could teach them some of the methods that we've developed, or there's the software tools. To some extent, I never viewed that as a product itself. Like, this shouldn't. I don't think it makes sense to have a training log and say, "Pay me to use my training log." I don't think that's a product, But at a certain point, you've added enough tools to it that you go, "Hey, if you're using all these tools, you probably see the value in it, and it's probably, there's probably a service involved here, and so it's like a step at a time. And at this point, we've been doing it for 15 years, so there's plenty of time to make all those incremental steps and missteps. And
it's interesting. Like, so if I go research how to build, an online coaching business, they talk about having a free lead generator on your website, which is, hey, if you give me your email so I can contact you with email marketing, I'll give you my free PDF guide of here's the top 10 tips of blank. Your free lead generator is the RTS software suite.
Yeah.
Which is insane.
Well, hopefully it's a good one.
Yeah, it's a very good one.
Yeah.
Well, if you take a step back for a second and you think about, again, the origins, because I love the origin story. I love when Mike tells it. I've heard it a bunch of times and I could keep hearing it. It doesn't get old. But when you think about the origins of why Mike got into doing what he was doing, it was to solve a problem of the cadets that he was working with and to help them to be able to have, the sustainable growth in their powerlifting coaching or powerlifting career. And then he started coaching people, and then he's now bringing on coaches and trying to teach them. And then he's creating systems to help them to coach and to keep people consistent. Right. So it makes sense that the training log is that kind of free lead generator, because he's providing tools to help solve problems, stress index, block reports, being able to track your training, looking at your stress. And I think that that's one of the reasons why Mike has built such a successful company, is because he's always thought about what's the end goal, to help people get stronger, and then to provide tools to help coaches and athletes to self-coach or to analyze their training and to hyper individualize their training and to get the best response they can. And I love what Mike just said about being careful about growing too much, because I think every company has to think about sustained, profitable growth, because all those words have to be in there. It has to be profitable, because you can grow and not be profitable. You have to say your underlying business has to be profitable, and it has to be sustainable. It is not sustainable in the current architecture that we have right now to add 50 other coaches. Even if we developed all the content in the world and all the powerlifting athletes decided to hire RTS, that's just not sustainable, because now you're going to get issues of biting the donut. You're going to get issues of, you need someone who's meeting with those coaches to make sure that they're coaching in a certain way. You need to make sure that the systems are robust enough, that the athletes have the experiences, right? And so, like, in the current architecture, we can't grow there right now, but we could in the future. If that's something that Mike wanted to do, if we wanted to do as an organization, you could get there. But you have to be thinking about all those things, the sustained, profitable growth, because you see this happen a lot. And Mike talked about it earlier. It just grew till he was at 80 athletes and was like, oh, crap, this didn't scale to be able to help me to, live the life that I want to lead too, because we're all individuals. I know, Newton, your big focus is on mental health. You have to take care of the individual. And the last thing that we want is our coaches who are, taking on 60 athletes and aren't able to take care of their own training, in the gym. Like, we want them to train. Like, Mike, that's another thing Mike had neglected to mention is, like, my training time is important. Like, that's one of the first things that Mike said to me is, like, I want you training, and I want you to actually schedule that in your time as, like, the first thing you do every single week is, like, block out time for training. Because if I don't train, I'm not taking care of John. And I'm also not thinking through all of the problems that my athletes are going to be going through. And you see this happen a lot with powerlifting coaches, is that they'll neglect their own training. They'll neglect their own training time and kind of put that second, third, and not happening at all. And I think it's an important thing to consider.
Hopefully this doesn't come across as too much of a shots fired kind of thing. But in my experience, once coaches stop training, I see their creativity fade. I see them solving. I'm certain that there's exceptions to this. This is way too broad to be a full-on rule, right? But I've seen it enough times that I'm saying it now, that coaches, whatever, think life gets busy, they lose interest, whatever, and they're no longer training. And it's almost like something switches to where they feel like they've got the answers that they're going to have. They've seen it all at this point. So somebody comes in, they have some sort of an issue, and this is the way that you solve that. And they, keep going forward. And I mean, I'm definitely not seeing that. I've got people on my roster right now that I'm struggling to find effective solutions for. And we've been through all the usual things. So either I'm just selection biasing for like the hardest candidates, which that could be a thing because of the messaging that we have. But I definitely think there's something to staying engaged with the thing that you care about. And I think this, for a coach, this comes to being mindful of your own training. And for me personally, I want to keep coaching. Like, I don't want to withdraw myself from coaching entirely. Maybe I'll have a constrained roster or something like that. I'm definitely not coaching 80. I'm not even coaching as many as John or Ross anymore. But I do want to coach a good amount of not just the people that I'm handpicking. I want to coach people that, that are not necessarily elite athletes. I want to coach people from a range of backgrounds so that I stay in touch with what it means to be a coach. So when we're developing these systems, I understand what it is that we're looking for. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think this really speaks to the importance of customer empathy. I think of it in maybe two ways. One, you're talking about the range of clients, but then there's nothing like that experience of getting under the bar and, getting wins and the losses. And then also throughout your week, having to kind of fight and claw to not have your training get knocked off the calendar. And that's something that, I'm guessing most of your athletes have to struggle with. And if you lose touch with that, then it all turns into sets and reps and movements. And that's, just a small, really narrow portion of I think, the problems you're trying to solve for athletes.
Yeah. It's like the life goes out of it, It's you're just hitting the button on the assembly line at that point. You're not creating something, and I think especially what we're trying to do is to create a training program that's like truly custom fit for an athlete. You can't assembly line your way out of that. You can automate a lot of processes, but that's not the same thing.
And to add to that, Mike, you even can see that evidence of that within the organization in the way that Mike has set things up. So Mike has encouraged me to use my continuous improvement background in the way that I talk with coaches and meet with them and talk about performance, but not just performance of like, here's how many clients you took on and here's your retention. It's not so mechanical, because we also talk about development. We're also talking about developing those skills. And you brought up the scenario of the assembly line worker. I mean, that's important work, in an organization. The key is you don't want a person just hitting the button and not thinking. You want the person hitting the button or doing the task, repetitive task that they need to do, but you also want them recognizing problems along the way because they're the closest to it. So if you have a coach that's coaching 40 athletes, you don't want them just writing 3 sets of 5 at an 8 RPE on squat. Like, you want them thinking through, like, why does that person respond to that and not this? And what am I seeing these commonalities? Because they're the closest to it. Because when they recognize those things and they recognize problems and they bring it to the organization gets better thinking through it. And that's one of the things that I think we as an organization have done a really great job of is like, even our newest coaches, Gabby and Kenny immediately brought on was like, hey, tell us if you see problems, tell us if you see opportunities. We want to hear the things that you're seeing and the ideas that you have, because they inform us and help us to solve more problems for more people. And I think that's an important component of any organization
too. So like, especially it's very visible with additional coaches. Like, we'll keep with the Gabby and Kenny example. I want to think about, what does RTS give them, and what value do I provide them? I know, the old saying goes like, I know what they do for us, and, the additional coaching capacity and, additional expertise and everything else that they're bringing to the table. But we have to provide something for them so that they stay and so that they, get something out of this. And it's got to be more than a paycheck. I think the paycheck, obviously that's important too, but like John, you're talking about professional development, and me being systems oriented, like I want to think about stuff like, oh, you're having to write out 3 sets of 5 reps every time. Can we find a way to make you not have to physically write that out? Can we speed this process along some way so you spend more time thinking about the important decisions to make rather than the mechanical writing of things? So and there's 1,000 little touch points like that. So can we do any of this stuff, and it makes you more effective at your job, and it does it in ways that you maybe wouldn't have the opportunity to do on your own. So it's a benefit of being involved with this organization that's unique to the organization.
And just to add to that, another thing that we've done in the past few years is we opened up the RTS Training Lab. Going back to Mike's roots of where this whole organization came from, is it was first a community before it was ever a business. And let me tell you something, we've noticed the retention increase in our coaching, like substantially increase. And I really truly believe that's the live office hours, but I also think it's the interconnection that people are making, the ability to stay engaged and to learn topics and ask questions. Because listen, I don't care how great of a coach you are. If you're coaching 40 people and people have questions, there's just no way for you to get to them fast enough, truly, because everybody is asking questions when it's top of mind, when it's just in time for the training session, or you're in the middle of the training session. What if you had a way to go to a community and ask that question and get a question from people that are reputable and also people that are in the trenches with you? And that's one of the cool things about the training lab that we've seen, is it's actually been a value add for our coaches. We had no idea that it was going to be such a big value add for the coaching staff. We talked about all the value in helping people that are self-coached and to bring people in. And we were always thinking about the athletes. We had no idea how impactful it was going to be for the coaching staff. And so that's the kind of thing that, thinking about Mike and thinking about trying to remove those annoyances, so to speak, in the writing of coaching and delivering, and really just freeing the coach up to coach.
And we've the value to those coaches.
Started
so
to
I
see
think
the past few
you talked
years.
about client retention, which of course is super important. Is there more there? Is it something around like the social connection to a larger community? Is it other things that they're getting from this community?
Yeah, I think the connection. I mean, I'm kind of assuming a good bit here, but I think being involved with the community, also like, not to turn into a training lab advertisement, but like the amount of stuff that you get for that's pretty ridiculous.
It is.
I mean, I was talking with someone the other day, and it's like, well, just you've got this thing going on, this persistent glute pain that we haven't been able to sort out. Just hop into an office hour with Dr. Daly, physical therapist, and this is coming at like no additional cost. You just hop in and ask him, and he tells you what he thinks and helps you through that. Like it's ridiculous. Like I don't know. Again, like there's features on features on features inside the training lab, but that was one that came up recently. And I think stuff like that, it matters to people. Trust is a huge thing. I think about that a lot. For me as an athlete, having a coach, uh, I have to be able to trust them. And that trust is, for me, a very fragile thing. So I assume that it's an equally fragile thing for everyone. So I want to treat it that way in as many cases as possible. So being able to solve those problems quickly and reliably it's important, and you do see it come through in number form as well.
Yeah, I think this goes back to like the beginning of our conversation where we had talked about with RTS. You were kind of knocking yourself a little bit, saying like, like sometimes I just record on my phone. I don't want to do high production value, but you've maintained the long form and the nuance and the willingness to take on these like really hard topics. And that brand, it extends to the community. Like people show. That's why I show up. That's why others show up. And so I know if I show up to that community and I want to have a conversation, it's not going to be it's not going to be superficial posting. It's people going to be really thoughtful about this, and they want to come with maybe hard, challenging questions and get a variety of thoughts on, hey, what might be going on here? So it's kind of like trust is really hard to scale, but by taking the long road and showing up really consistently and building RTS so thoughtfully, it's now seems to be infused through this online community, which is really hard to do.
That's awesome. And I think about it just kind of trying to do what I would want to have done. Like if I, as a powerlifter, want to create content that I find interesting. And I mean, that's a bit of a self-centered way to run a business, I guess, but in some ways it can work out. Like I would have a difficult time trying to be anything else, Self-centered is one way to say it. Authentic is another way to say it, I guess. So.
Well, let me build on this because I will have to take off to my next thing in a moment. So I'm going to close here, and going back to this question of scaling and how big you want RTS to become. You don't want it to grow forever, but you want it to be bigger than it is today. So if you think about that, bigger than it is today, like for the sake of what? Like what do you want RTS to be able to do that it can't do today for both the clients, but then also you built this for you and your family? Like where do you want this to land for you and your family so you can live the life you want? And John, you as part of this ride, I'd love to hear what you have to say about those questions too.
Yeah. I guess for me, I would love to get to a point. It's a little bit cliche to say like financial security, because I think that's a moving target anyway. I think the more you have, there's never a point where you're like, "Yep, I'm good," or not often a point where
I haven't found it
consistently. Yeah, so I would like to have more financial security than I've got currently. I talked a bit about like our family dynamic and like how that's arranged. So it's not like that's got to happen at all costs. We'll be fine if it doesn't, but that's kind of the role that it fills in my family life. But it's a huge creative outlet for me. Like this is always what I would have been doing if I didn't have anything else to do anyway. So there's that, like the solving of the problem is just interesting to me, and so it's trying to figure it out. And like from a client standpoint, I want to continue to find ways to provide a better service to clients. If I look at the way what we're developing currently centers around training solutions for powerlifters, and I think lots of powerlifters feel like this problem has been solved already. They feel like training is training, and now there's auto regulation, and so it's as good as training is going to get. How much better could it get? Well, I think it could get quite a bit better, and I'm putting a lot of effort into making it so. I can tell you, like I'm, a week and a half out from NAPF. this is the best prep that I've had maybe ever. You know, I'm 38. I've had a lot of miles and a lot of injuries at this point. And even recently, you know, training for competitions have left me feeling pretty beat up. This one has been going awesome. And if you ask me, we'll do a whole podcast on why, maybe after the comp. But if you ask me why right now, I think a lot of it has to do with the new ways of managing training, the attention to detail that we're applying to it. So I think it can make a big difference to people. So I think that's kind of where I'm spending the effort there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. There's so much to be learned. Like so I've been training with Mark Robb since 2017. He got me prepped for my first Raw Nationals as an M160 kilo. So I had just turned 40. So it was 66 kilo M1. I'm about to compete at Raw Nationals as a 56 kilo at one day before my 45th birthday. I can outlet the crap out of that guy from 2018. And it was, continuing with Mark, applying the methodology, learning more deeply. And while RTS keeps bringing in new methods, new tools. So clearly I'm like, I'm a data point of 1, but down 10 kilos, totals up, I'm older, I'm stronger, I'm recovering faster. Something seems to be working.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
John, you get the last word on this question. Like, what do you want RTS to become for both you and the world?
Well, my passion is helping people get stronger. And because of that, I'm here, and that's what I love doing. So there's the coaching aspect of the answer, which is continuing to work with athletes. And I agree with Mike, no matter what level I'm at in the organization, no matter what projects I'm in, I want to be coaching. That's a piece that I don't want ever taken off my plate. That being said, I really enjoy working with other coaches and helping them, coming alongside them, and potentially see blind spots that they didn't see, because it's always better to have two heads when you're looking at a problem, in my opinion. And being able to come alongside those coaches. I would love to see RTS continue to grow and have more coaches so that I can partner with them and help them through the problem solving. Because one of the cool things with that is now I'm not just helping the coach, but I'm helping all of their athletes too. So when you start thinking about scale, like how cool is that to have an influence on the coach and thereby influence their athletes? And think about how many people you influence. Like Mike has no idea how many people he's influenced because of his writings and his teaching and his courses. And that's the truth, how much you have influenced other people. And I think that that's a cool thing, is like thinking about what your legacy is going to be. So personally, it would be those two things. I'd love to see RTS continue with the data solutions that we have and our development and get more refined, maybe get app-based at some point. I think there's so many cool opportunities there with the things that we're trying to develop that would provide tools not just to our athletes, but to other coaches. And ultimately, I would love to convince the world that auto-regulation and individualized training are the way. This is the way to be able to auto-regulate and individualize training. And if we can supply tools to athletes and coaches, I truly believe that we will get more coaches to do that versus like, hey, you're going to do 3 sets of 5 and an 8 RPE, and that's your program, linear periodization over the entire block. Well, so those are the kind of high points.
RTS is well on its way. I think for every high level lifter I don't know anyone who's using stock programs. Auto regulation from when I came into this versus now, I see way fewer people poo-pooing auto-regulation. We kind of just accept it. Like, yeah, of course you have to do that. So I'm pretty stunned with how far that movement's come. I think you guys have a lot of the tools in place to scale coaching. One comment, you can think about this, how this affects your business, but you have so many of the tools to scale RTS methodology to other coaches, but then the organization itself, John, you're talking about the architecture of the organization, limiting why you wouldn't take on 50 coaches. That actually now creates a scarcity of people who are actual RTS coaches. You're like, yeah, RTS methodology, but did Mike Tuchscherer hire you? No, he didn't. So congrats, John. Your value just went up in the market. So something to play with there as you grow.
Well, let me comment on that for a second. When I got tapped to come and be a part-time coach for RTS, contract coach, and then obviously full-time after, if I had to go against our recent
Same
hires,
here, to be honest.
I don't know that I would get selected. Like Mike and I have talked about that, and that's so cool. How cool is it, Mike, for you to have built an organization where you could question whether or not you'd be hired in it.
That's right.
Be good enough to go against the people that are in it.
I think that's awesome. Legacy, and that's how you scale quality. So good for you.
Yeah. Newton, thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate you doing this. Coming up with this idea is easy and enjoyable for me. So thanks. I appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to do it. I came in because I wanted to learn, like, how the heck did you build this? Because as I look at my own world and where you guys are at, I'm like, there's so much to be explored, so much to be done. But I'm very inspired. I'm leaving very inspired by your story. So thank you.
Well, thanks again, man. Thanks for being here. Thanks. Good luck to you and everything going forward. I'm sure we'll have you on another podcast soon. Thanks everybody for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.